We talked about surfaces and we talked about their normals and how to make some simple surfaces. We're not going to use the surfacing or mesh tools yet. We're just going to make lines and 3D faces and extrusions and thick lines and those kinds of things. But we're going to make surfaces to create a little stone skirting around the front of this house. Now here's the solid, and we notice we have a hole cut in for the window. If we look at the elevation of this little house, let's go get it up here, we see it. We've got this kind of a stone skirt wall here. And there's the wall that now we're going to add trim and some of those things later. We cut a hole because we're going to put a window in there later, but I want to make this little stone skirt that kind of protrudes out and has a little cap. I want to look at how maybe I would make some of that with surfaces. So back to the model that I had going on. This little line right here, which indicates the slab, kind of follows out, bumps out for that little stone projection. So I'm going to go ahead and use this outline to represent where that stone might be. It might be a fraction of an inch off, but it looks like something great to trace. So here I go. I'm going to make a polyline, and I'm just going to go from this point to here. Remember, that's right to left because it's facing the other way, left to right because it's facing me, left to right, and I say, well, what's happening? I'm going to actually go to the perpendicular of this point right here, because if we look back at the elevation, we'll notice that this whole solid piece here is stone. So back to the model, I'm going to have to treat this differently because this portion of the solids is not actually, at this point, made correctly. I'm going to slice it and fix that later. But let's just talk about these little lines here at the bottom and how I can use those to make surfaces. So I grabbed that polyline I made right there, and I'm going to give it a thickness. But then the question is, what is the thickness I'm going to give it? Now, I'm going to go ahead right now and think that maybe that's a 3-foot tall little skirt wall. And if I go in here and look at it in the conceptual view, I can see it's shaded. Now there's a gap between that surface and this solid that makes the wall. And sometimes students ask, well, what about that? We're not going to see through this surface, so we don't care. We don't need to fill that in. All we care about is the surface that renders. So that's one of the reasons that when we can use surfaces to create our models, we can actually make a more efficient model that will render more quickly. All we care about is the surfaces that we see. I'm going to grab this. It's on the construction layer right now. I'm going to go ahead and put that on the 3D stone layer because that's really what it's going to be. But now we're going to kind of look, how do we maybe start to manipulate this? Because it can't really come all the way up here. We look back at that elevation, and it's cut down low where the window is. So back to the model, how are we going to do that? Now we can't actually use subtract on a surface. Subtractions, Boolean commands up here. These guys right here only work for solids and some other special types of surfaces, but for most of your surfaces that aren't regions, we can't use Booleans. We'll talk about regions later. So instead, I'm going to actually use the trim command. Now, I'm going to make a little line here just so I've got something to trim from. I'm going to put myself on ortho so it trims it straight. And I'm going to make another line. And one of the reasons I like to use the construction layer is that I know that those are just temporary. I'm going to use the trim command, and I can grab these two trim edges, and I can actually trim out the center of that guy. So what did I do? I trimmed the line, but it's the line with thickness, right? Here we are again with that line. Go look at the properties. It is 3 feet tall, but it's just been trimmed. So now we have two sections that are 3 feet tall. So what can I do? I can make a line in between the two pieces and make that thickness, I can grab it right there, a little bit less. Now how tall does it need to be? It needs to be, I think 2 feet. Let's go back and look. That one looks a little bit small, but I'm going to go ahead and make it 2 feet and verify that. So, oops, I just made a mistake here. Notice that the thickness came out straightforward at me. And it's a good point to actually point that mistake out. I did not expect that. But the thing you want to remember about your surfaces is that they come out in the z direction. So for some reason, that line right there is a line that's coming out in the z direction. I'm going to erase that again and try another line. Let's try that again. Line from here to there. And now, I don't know why it got a different UCS last time, 2 feet. Now it's standing up. I don't know how I did that. But if I go ahead and match the properties of this one to that one, notice it not only changes the layer, but it changes the thickness. Because now that there's two things selected, the thickness went to 3 feet. So you don't want to necessarily match properties when you're using thicknesses. Back down to 2 feet, looks like that's where I want to be. So there's two segments of polyline that I trimmed out, and I put another segment of line in. I went from left to right so that it would be counterclockwise and facing me, and I put another piece in there, and now when I go ahead and shade that, there's some actual surfaces there, and they will render the way I want them to. So now I'm going to make the stone cap, and I'm going to go ahead and make a polyline, and again I'm going to go right to left, and it's not really snapping. Too many things are going on. CAD wants to put all this great stuff on here. One of them is really bad. The dynamic UCS is what made that line be the wrong way last time somehow. A lot of this dynamic input, snaps are good, but this dynamic input, what we want to do is look at our settings for our snaps and minimize that. Extension is bad. It's just bouncing all over this 3D world. I like to keep endpoint and intersection, maybe center. That's good enough. Let's try this again. Polyline. There we go. Now it's not freaking out when I try to snap. And I'm going to come over to all the way back to here again. And I'm going to offset that. Now, offset in the XY direction. I have to offset it out a couple of inches. 2 might be too much, but I don't care. Let's give it some depth. And so now we have this line, and I can get that guy and make it have a thickness, when I go to my properties, of 4 inches for the 4-inch stone cap. And I can actually put it on the 3D stone cap layer, which is a little bit different color. So when we say, okay, that's great, but how are we going to actually close this thing up? It's not a solid. Now, you like the solids for a number of reasons. One, because you don't have to worry about this stuff. We extrude it and it's done. But let's trim this out. 1, 2 trim edges, and then we can trim that out, and we're kind of there we are there. But if we look at this thing from below, we don't have the cap pieces, so we're actually going to need to make some 3D faces and go counterclockwise to actually make the surfaces that are the bottom of this. So you can already see this is a little bit more work than making a solid, which is why typically you'll revert to solid modeling. But we want to learn about surfaces, and we want to learn about normals and keeping track of them. And there's times when filling in the gaps with just a simple surface, even though it seems right now, I'm going to use perpendicular, to be more work, is a good way to go. Now, I'm going to have to change all these to the stone cap layer, and I don't really have a line there, but I think I can snap to the perpendicular here, and there you see I've got, let's do one more, 3F, from this point to the perpendicular of the corner, to the perpendicular of the edge of the window, and out here, and then you kind of notice that wherever we don't close the gap, we're going to actually render a hole in our model. So a lot of times what I'll use these surfaces for is if I've got a couple solids and there's a gap between them, like this, let's say this was a solid, not just a surface, and that was a solid, I can just quickly pick the snap to 4 points and snap in between. Now you might say, why don't you fill this in? Well, we're actually going to plug some window trim and some other things into here. So I think this is just good enough to grab these edges, not that one, this one, and this one. And let's go ahead and change those to the stone cap layer. The bottom ones are off the wrong layer too, but I'm not going to take time to change those, obviously. Now we've got some surfaces. Well, if we think about it though, okay, it comes all the way around. It's all good. And again, the window block that I'm going to plug in, I'm going to create that such that it fills those other gaps. And this will have to turn into stone, and I'll have to put a trim over there. But this is how I was talking in class about having us use the lines. Now, 3D faces, remember, they're a little bit better because let's think about what we did before. If I grab the bottom of that line and move it out here, the whole line goes with me. The whole thickness stays the same when I do that. If I grab this point on my 3D face, it just, well, that's a line. If I grab this point on the 3D face, notice that it just stretches everything down, so it totally behaves differently. The 3D face, again, is just picking 4 points and filling them in, and then you can actually move them around if you miss your snap. The line is a little bit more rigid, or the polyline. It wants to actually stay as a line with a thickness. You just change the vertices, and the thickness, or the tall height part, will just go with you. So that's how we're going to do our little stone surfaces at the front of sketch exercise 1, and hopefully this helps you if you get lost. Otherwise, you'll need to go ahead and chase me down, and I can help you out.